I wrote the book inclusive. Oh, there we go. So I wrote the book Inclusive Leadership, Navigating Organizational Complexity, because, well, there's loads of reasons, but one of the reasons was there was a lot of data that I was getting from working in organizations and with organizations that sometimes wasn't getting captured in how we think about inclusion, inclusive leadership. So this conversation today, and a lot of it is me talking you through some things, but this conversation is about sharing some of those kind of key insights without flooding you with too much information or too much data. So let's see how well we do at this. My name is Sheila Walsh. It's pronounced Sheila, but it's spelt that way because I'm Irish, and my it's very important to my dad that our name is spelt in the Irish way, but it makes it very difficult internationally. But it's just called Sheila. So before we kick off and I give you some information, it'd be really great to get a sense of what you think about when we think of inclusion and leadership. What comes to mind for you, either together or separately? So either inclusive leadership or when you think of inclusion and leadership. And if you could pop that into the chat, that will give me something to lean on a little bit as I talk through the rest of today's session. So I'll give you a chance in the chat just to kind of give some definitions or what it brings up for you. And just to say, I'll never ask you to engage with me if there's a right or a wrong answer, because that kind of sets people up to be uncomfortable. So there's lots of different answers to this question. So I'd like to know what yours are. So I'll just give you a moment, pop something in so that I can connect to it and kind of kick off from there. I'm not seeing anyone type, so I'm just hoping that you're typing a thoughtful message. Otherwise, I'll be sitting here with my own definition. Okay, while you're typing, I'm hoping you're typing. What I'm going to do is move on through some of the definitions that I do have, because I think that it can be helpful to understand what it is I'm actually talking about. But I'd really like to know what comes to mind for you when you think of inclusion and leadership, because one of the things I've learned in my own research is that it's wildly defined. And even within academic writing and research, we're not always talking about the same thing, even though we're using the same language. So I break it up into two parts. I break it up into the word inclusion and I break it up into the word leadership. So, inclusion is a social process, meaning that it occurs between people or with people. It could be two people or more. It occurs when a person is valued for their uniqueness and are facilitated to experience belonging by another or others. Now, Shore et al. In 2011 kind of created this very basic framework for it, which was this idea that if you have belonging without uniqueness, you get assimilation. If you have uniqueness without belonging, we get a lot of individualizing, but not necessarily in a performance way. It's more so in the way that I'll go to somebody for their identity, but maybe not for their professional identity. I'm going to them for something else in their identity. And so this definition of inclusion, there's loads of definitions, is the one I use because it talks about what happens between people and it talks about the experience people have of that. The next one is about leadership. And again, I frame leadership as a social process because it happens between the role a person fulfills and those they influence, so the followers. If you don't have followers, I would argue it's very difficult to lead because there's no one to lead. But there are different types of leadership that we talk about. So I'm thinking about inclusive leadership as something that happens between or with people. Okay. The definition I put on it is inclusive leadership is when a leader, positional, thought, or social. So positional is what we traditionally think about, which is a leader with a title. Thought leadership is really, really interesting because it's when you might follow someone because of their thought leadership, because they're a great mind or they share great information, or they might be an expert in an area, like you might go to your accountant and follow their leadership on your accounts. So there's something about their thinking that you will follow. And then social leadership, what I really love about this is about the person who influences others and leads them into directions based on the relationships that they cultivate, more one or more relationships. Now, what's really interesting that I think about social leadership is when I've looked into how people are marginalized and how marginalized folks are able to continue in leadership or become successful in areas that there are systemic barriers. What's really interesting is that we know that for marginalized folks to be successful in systems that are not designed for them, they're probably already doing social leadership long before they have positional leadership. And they're having to think about how they impact people, interact with people, and build relationships. And so what I do like about this definition is we acknowledge that people might have been practicing social leadership before they have a position, and equally that there might be an advantage for those that are marginalized. They actually might be stronger at social leadership than others. And that's something that there isn't strong evidence on, but there are suggestions towards. And a couple of different pieces of research have led us to understand that for people who are marginalized to be at the same level as those with less marginalized identities, they've done more. They've had to effort more usually or overcome more barriers. And so there is a strength that those who are marginalized often have in the room with those with less marginalized identities. And we don't always talk about inclusion that way. We talk about it often indirectly as if we're lowering standards. But by acknowledging the social part, we're pointing to the fact that actually we might be heightening standards by being more inclusive. And then the other part is that it utilizes inclusion practices to contribute to the task at hand. Now, why this is important to me is in a lot of my research, what's being suggested when I talk to people about inclusive leadership is actually that they're thinking only about inclusion and not the purpose of leadership. And so inclusive leadership in different settings has a different purpose, just like leadership in different settings has a different purpose. And so how does inclusive leadership show up in settings that are not solely about the inclusion part of that statement, but actually there's a responsibility for delivering outcomes? So that's how, when I talk about inclusive leadership, this is what I'm thinking about. And again, I just want to be really clear. It isn't right, it isn't wrong, it is a perspective. And I say that because there's lots of perspectives on this topic, and there's a lot of different angles on it that are really valuable. So the one thing I like to start with is we all belong in society, but not automatically in every organization. So what I mean by this is that in society, it's my belief from a human rights perspective that anybody within that society has a right to belong there and be protected and engage with their human rights. But in an organization, we first have to gain entry to the organization for belonging to occur. And we usually gain entry to organizations based on our value. So what we're adding, the value add. So for instance, in the example I always give, I might like to be the president of the Law Society of Ireland, but because I'm not a lawyer, I don't meet the initial criteria. And so I don't belong in that space. But in society, I do belong regardless of the criteria that I meet. And this is one definition from my research that's become really important to understand, because when we think about inclusion in the perspective of all, without thinking about the context, it can actually end up overwhelming people. And it can end up that we don't really make critical decisions that are good for organizations and people. Belonging in work comes through contribution to purpose. And we're going to talk about some of the flaws with how we measure that, because there are lots of flaws that reinforce inequity. But when we go to work, we usually go to work because we're adding value in some way. And so by being in work and adding value, we belong there. Now, that doesn't mean we experience the feeling of belonging, which is what inclusion is about, or partially about, as well as our uniqueness. But it does mean that the fact that we're adding something, we do belong in theory in the setting that we are. One of the things that a lot of people think about when I talk about this is they think I'm going to ask them to do loads more. And one of my big pushbacks is whenever I've worked with organizations, it's usually about doing things better rather than doing more. And that's a little bit of a pushback of what's happened in the DEI space. DEI, sorry, in Ireland, it's a very common term that we use. There's an argument over the E. I mean diversity, equity, and inclusion when I say DEI. And so a big kind of assumption around inclusion and inclusive leadership is that people are going to have to do more. And my pushback is it's about doing better, which is highly linked to performance anyway. Organizational performance, team performance, group performance, individual performance. So one of the problems that we have with inclusion that I'm seeing in practice is that it's treated as a compliance checklist. So often people collapse discrimination legislation and inclusion together. And this is really problematic. So depending on where you are in the world right now, the country you're in will have a different degree of discrimination protection than other countries. And because of that, how inclusion and diversity is approached will have a very different reality to it. So, for instance, in Ireland, a lot of the efforts around inclusion is an attempt to not discriminate according to the legislation, similar in the UK and across Europe. Whereas in the States, while there might have been legislation, we know that with political changes that are happening, that you could be losing the right or the protection, and therefore inclusion may not be something organizations opt for. So recently, due to um, the the orders that went through. My brain is blanking on the first word, but the orders that went through, a lot of international organizations contacted me to say we can no longer do diversity and inclusion work because it's illegal. And I was saying, no, it's not that it's illegal, it's that how you do it has been regulated now. For better or for worse, it's been regulated, and we need to adapt our approach to that legislation and to those executive orders. That's the word. And so inclusion, when it's treated from a compliance checklist point of view, is really problematic because the only thing we can measure inclusion is a moment in time and how someone feels. But if I've just had a really good interaction with my manager or my team and I felt included, then my results might be different to after having an argument with them. And so they're not stagnant because inclusion is a social process and it's moving. And so a lot of the compliance approaches lack the ability to actually be accurate or to be effective because it doesn't take into account the external influences that might be impacting the results of that. The other pushback that I give because it's become quite problematic is treating it as a D&I activity. So the business is going about its business. We bring in a D&I person, and now they want to do these additional activities. A big pushback that I have is that actually, if we integrate DEI into how we do business, um, and we link it to performance, then it's something that can't be untangled out of the structure or out of how we do business. And the example I give is from one of the participants of my research. And he said, imagine if health and safety was done the way D&I is being done right now. He said nobody would be doing it. But D&I is so, health and safety is so weaved in that I can't do most of my jobs without making sure that I'm compliant to health and safety automatically. I have to consider risk. I have to consult with people who might have a certain experience of it. I have to consider greater implications of the decisions I make when it comes to health and safety. And I think that's an example of when we integrate something so much that it's part of how we do every job rather than an additional add-on, it's a lot harder to undo within the system because it's weaved into it. My example for that one is always about white supremacy. I said, if you had an executive order that said no more white supremacy, that would be really difficult to actually change because white supremacy has been weaved in so intrinsically into the fabric of organizations that we wouldn't be able to undo it or track it that easily. Well, if we can do the same with diversity and inclusion work, that it's weaved into how we do our business and do it well, then it becomes really hard for any executive order or for any agenda to actually unpack it. So inclusion and inclusive leadership needs to be part of how we do things, as opposed to an additional extra thing. When it's an additional extra thing, it might not be a priority or it can be deprioritized as the political agenda influences it. A big pushback people have is that it can slow things down. One of the things that I found in the research so far in kind of tracking interventions is it can slow things down up front because you're doing a better design or a better consultation process. But ultimately, it can speed things up because you're not going to get to the same roadblocks that we do when we force things without thinking them through. So not only can it create a better outcome, it can actually speed things up after we've done the initial kind of considerations that are required. One of the big fears when I sit with leaders privately and I say to them, this is confidential, I can't repeat what you say to me. Most of the time they're afraid of getting it wrong and they ask me what I would consider sometimes very basic questions because what they're trying to do is understand what they can and can't say because there is a massive fear of being cancelled. And I always kind of have two positions on this. I have one is there are problematic people who cancel culture has actually been designed for. And if I use Harvard's calling in and calling out model, there are times where people are getting it wrong because they don't have access to the knowledge or they haven't accessed it or it hasn't come across their path before. They haven't attended the training, they haven't read the book, they haven't reflected on it. And then there's people who actively weaponize it. And what's happening is because there's It's visible when people actively weaponize it and then get it wrong, but intentionally nonetheless, and then are cancelled or have a very public outcry, then people who wouldn't be of that way of working are also afraid of that happening to them, even though it's not their intention, even though they might not know where they need to start or what they need to look at. And so the fear of getting it wrong, including what language to use sometimes, um, or just is it okay to say this? The amount of people that say to me, is it okay to say this? And I'm thinking, if it's a genuine question, then it's okay to say it. If you can't figure out that answer and this is the appropriate setting to ask it, then it's okay to ask it. But that fear of getting it wrong raises the fear of shame and experiencing shame. And so this is why a lot of people, that 80% in the middle of the two extremes, don't say anything. And it's often because they are so afraid of getting it wrong that they'd rather not get involved. And this is really problematic for inclusive leadership and inclusion in organizations because we actually need people activated. So working with that fear of getting it wrong and finding ways to interact with it can help us move the dial forward, I guess. Often people say to me, and again, this is from data in my research, that DEI feels disconnected. It's extra, it's not embedded. They say things to me like, I know I should do it, but I just don't have enough time in the day. I don't know how it connects to me. I did the unconscious bias training. Surely that's enough. There's this kind of sense that it's not really part of their role. And one of the things that I've done with a semi-state body in Ireland is we've talked about making all management training having an understanding of inclusive practices and an understanding of discrimination legislation and what good inclusive practice looks like, rather than it being a separate training, that any management training should have it integrated and any leadership training should have it integrated. And then once it's integrated, what we found is that people tend to realize that it is very much their business and part of their life, and it's not this separate thing for other people. Or the other thing that can happen is people who are marginalized can traditionally think that DEI is for them, which is fine, but not always appreciate that they're also responsible for co-creating inclusion and being inclusive in their leadership as well. So it can be very disconnected even from the personal view. Ooh, I just pressed a button that I wasn't meant to press. There we go. Okay. So I've already talked about this, that we belong when we contribute to the purpose. Now, that doesn't mean we feel we belong, but the fact that we're in the organization contributing to the purpose means we do belong. The feeling, though, is a different experience. I position inclusion as a human need because when we look at in-group and out-group dynamics and we look at the fear of public speaking and other common human fears, it usually comes down to whether I will be experience a sense of belonging. So I belong here and I'm allowed to be myself. And so I've started to talk about inclusion as a human need, as opposed to as a DEI agenda. Because when I frame it as this and I talk to people about how when we're excluded, the impact it has on our physiology, our psychology is quite extreme. People start to understand that even if they don't have a marginalized identity or their identities generally are privileged, they understand that when they don't feel included or they feel excluded, that they do have uncomfortable experiences. And then that can help them often relate to when there's also systemic exclusion or oppression within someone's experience, as well as the interpersonal moments of inclusion and exclusion. And just a nice little fact on exclusion, you don't actually have to do anything to exclude someone. I find this really interesting. You don't actually have to do something to exclude someone. It can be a signal. And so people don't need overt expressions of exclusion to experience exclusion. Often they experience exclusion through subtle signals, signals that can be very subtle, including things like nothing is written in their language. There's only a certain type of dress code. Uh, the definition of professionalism is a certain way. They don't get the joke. My example was I was in a meeting once and someone made a joke in Latin, and that in the UK is often connected to an upper class or higher middle class experience. But in that moment, everyone in the room knew I wasn't from that background, but they also knew they all were. And that was they weren't trying to exclude me. They made a joke, but that joke let us all know my background and theirs. And so exclusion doesn't need to be intentional. It is simply a signal that the environment isn't designed for that person's uniqueness and for them to belong. They weren't the person that was thought of during the design of that moment. The other thing is it does support performance and not just fairness. And I really push on this because my background's coaching psychology. And what I really love about this is when we include people in a work setting specifically, they don't have to do as much acrobats to manage the biases or marginalization that they experience. And so they can actually focus all their energy into actually what they're doing rather than also navigating these additional biases. And so when we utilize inclusion in a work setting, we can actually create space for people to perform rather than requiring them to jump through additional hoops and perform on top of it. I have a real pushback on inclusive leadership being taught as rules. And the reason I have this pushback is that often the rules have a particular lens and in and of themselves are oppressive. I think about inclusion as inclusive leadership as a set of principles. If I want to practice it, I have to have a set of principles that I lean on that help me make good decisions rather than this idea that when you do this, that's good, and when you do this, that's bad. While there are occasions where certain things are clearly bad, there's often a lot more nuance in what helps people to feel that they belong and also that their uniqueness is valued is a lot more nuanced than we generally talk about it. So real inclusion is embedded and not optional. And this is back to that health and safety piece. If inclusion is taught as an add-on to everything that anyone's doing in the workplace, then it's not something that is embedded and weaved in. And therefore, it won't occur during difficult times, during pressure, during high stress, during, deadlines looming. Real inclusion has to be so embedded that it doesn't require an individual to just think inclusively, but that actually there's so many opportunities for inclusion and signals to practice inclusive practices that it's embedded. So it's not optional. You can't go, oh, I just didn't think about it, because it's inbuilt into a number of different parts of the fabric of the organization. So we know this, it's the one thing the evidence tells us repeatedly is high performing teams are inclusive teams. Now, what's interesting is you can have a high performing team that's inclusive and not diverse. And the reason for that is in groups spend less time kind of figuring out the rules. The issue with that is that those groups who are high performing, inclusive but not diverse, tend to actually access a limited amount of options or solutions. So they have less access to a broader selection of options or solutions or wider thinking. And so while they might be high performing teams, if they were to compete with a high performing, diverse, inclusive team, the diverse, inclusive team is more likely to win, because inclusion without differences can often just create groupthink. So when I was doing looking at the research and I was looking at what people told me in organizations worked, this will be clearer when you get this in the handout afterwards. I found that there are kind of 13 practices and principles that can help inclusive leadership be more effective in the workplace. One is aligning it to organizational purpose, performance, and inclusion. So thinking about it through those three lenses. The other was by spending time on effective communication, you can improve inclusive leadership. Leveraging differences. So that's the example I've just given. You can have a load of people together who feel inclusive, but actually they're going to experience groupthink rather than really coming up with optimal outcomes. So leveraging differences, but not just identity differences. That's one big pushback I'm seeing quite a bit on, which is that people are now, through an attempt to be inclusive and demonstrate diversity and representation, people are now their identities being exploited in workplaces, which is that uniqueness piece. And for instance, I was working with a Muslim lady, and what she said to me was, I'm on the cover of all my organization's materials. She's an accountant. I'm on the cover of all my organization's materials because I'm visibly Muslim and I have a marginalized ethnicity and racial identity. But the reality is I'm only 1% of the whole organization, but I am on 80% of the marketing material. And the issue with this, and for her specifically, the issue was she started to be known as the Muslim woman doing diversity work in our organization rather than being the leader in the accountancy area. And that was really problematic because it gave her extra work she had to do to hold her professional identity, because her personal identity was being exploited by the organization for its gain, with good intentions but not a great impact, because it meant that she was carrying the burden of that further. The other thing is utilizing curiosity. I've gone to so many D&I trainings where they tell you how things should be. And I was in one, and I'm very dyslexic and diagnosed and very dyslexic. And the person said, you're not allowed to say someone's dyslexic. You have to say they have dyslexia, but you must say that people are autistic. So I stopped them and I said, sorry, where did you get that information? And they said, oh, the charities told us that. And I was like, what charities? Now, the charities weren't being run by people with either identity, which was a bit of a problem in the first place, in my opinion. But the second thing was, it's a really big problem to tell a group of people what is and isn't right without checking if anybody in that room has a preference and shares identity and would like to share that conversation. But also, it was really problematic because it reminded me that while I could say, actually, no, that's inaccurate. I say I'm dyslexic because it's wider than um, a learning difficulty that I experience. It's weaved into lots of things, the way my brain works, the way I talk to people, so many other things. There's lots of other topics I've attended that I didn't have that lived experience to push back on, and lived and researched experience to push back on. And so a lot of people are attending training where there isn't a lot of curiosity and conversation being had, but a lot of telling. And that is creating some difficulty in the practice. And so that's where utilizing curiosity can be helpful. Effective collaboration. If you collaborate well, it's going to make it easy to be an inclusive leader, because to collaborate is to say your idea and my idea together make a third idea. And it's not about a competition or competing. And therefore, where there's collaboration, there's less likelihood of dominance occurring, because collaboration requires sharing power and sharing ideas and creating a new optimal idea. Growth mindset, I think, is an obvious one that's important. Growth mindset's important because if I have fixed mindset and I find out that I've said something that's highly homophobic or racist or sexist or misogynistic, and I have fixed mindset, I'm going to believe I'm a bad person, or I'm going to reject the idea that I'm a bad person, this thing that's being pushed back. No, you're wrong. That wasn't racist, homophobic, sexist. So I'm either going to have to reject the feedback or reject myself. When we engage with a growth mindset, it allows us to say, okay, I didn't know that. I can now learn about it. And I'm not a bad person for not knowing something. I might feel guilt for hurting someone or harming someone or having a negative impact, but I don't have to go into the shame spiral and therefore reject myself or reject the other person. And so a growth mindset is really, really important for inclusive leaders. Emotional intelligence, and I'm sure we all have examples of why that is. The other part that's important is strategic practices. Sometimes people are tactical and not strategic with inclusion and inclusive leadership, but we need to be strategic because it needs to be sustainable beyond, celebration days or parties or pins. It needs to be something that is strategically linked to the purpose of the business and the things that people are connected to. Otherwise, it fades away with the effort. So you make an effort to celebrate Pride, let's say, big effort, and then the flags go away and the event's over, but it's used a lot of energy and resources, but you haven't necessarily got the impact that's required. And so we need to be strategic in order to be effective inclusive leaders. We also need to understand that inclusive leadership is all about how we use our power, because there's the systemic power and then there's the interpersonal power that happens between us, and then there's things like the positional power, so the position that you have and your identity and the power that has. Cultivating a learning environment. If I can't make a mistake, we're not going to learn together and move forward. And if in inclusive leadership, the individual leader and or the environment they're leading in isn't allowed to make mistakes and learn from them, we're going to create an environment of fear, which is going to make it really difficult to practice inclusive leadership, because inclusive leadership requires that we're sharing power and having conversations and learning from each other. Navigating complexity. So this is really just to say that anything in an organization has complexity. There's context, there's timing, there's geography, there's industry, there's the professions involved. All of these things bring something new to life. The example I have is that when we join an organization, we generally join to help it create a profit if we work in a profit. But in an academic setting, a lot of people join institutions not because of the institution, but because of their field of study. And that then changes the context of how inclusive leadership or inclusion might occur in that context. Because in one context, there might be something shared. The reason for going is because we can all contribute to this task. But in an academic setting, for instance, people might be joining institutions because they want the role within their area of expertise. And that's a very different starting point if we're trying to create more inclusion and inclusive leadership. Um, Co-creating conditions for performance. So one of the areas that has come up in my research is that when we talk about inclusion, we mostly talk about what others should do, or we talk about whether we feel included or not. And what's really interesting is when you look at performance, you have to co-create that, right? So I can't just go to work and work really hard and perform really well, because if I do that over a period of time and I burn out, you could say, well, Sheila's not performing very well. Or you can say, well, actually, there's an environment that Sheila was engaging with that had an impact on her performance. And so, just like in sports, we don't think performance is solely down to the individual. It's to do with their environment, it's to do with the relationships they have, their self talk, the opportunities that exist, the challenges that exist, their rest and recouping. That's the same way I position. If we co create conditions for performance and we think about it systemically, environmentally, in the team, and individually, we're already being more inclusive because we're considering the things that impact people and create different levels of barriers or access to things. And then last but not least, and this is because my background is in systemic psychodynamic, but is group and team dynamics. We can do an awful lot of work around inclusive leadership and inclusion and leadership and team performance if we do not spend time thinking about the dynamics of the team and the group and how they function and what we've normalized and what climate and culture we're normalizing in those teams and groups, then inclusive leadership will really struggle. But if we spend time understanding group dynamics and the team's dynamics and what's occurring, we're going to be more effective when we engage with inclusive leadership. So these are kind of 13 practices and principles that when someone comes to me and they say, I'm not sure if what I'm doing is effective, it usually, and it's not comprehensive, I'm sure there's other ones and somebody else in the research world will find them. But these are the 13 that I can usually trace it back to needing some attention in order to be more effective in their efforts to be an inclusive leader, and being effective in their leadership and not just rolling out the actions of inclusion without thinking about the purpose of the work that they're doing and the leadership. So another example of this is co-creating psychological safety. Professor Jervis Bush wrote a paper pushing back on psychological safety, saying that a lot of people are presuming it to be something that's given to somebody or that should be facilitated by another. And he talks about in this white paper about the fact that psychological safety needs to be co-created. And that's something I think is really important for inclusive leadership. If we think that psychological safety is kind of given from one person to another and not that it must be shared, then we're already thinking kind of one dimensionally rather than inclusively. If we think about psychological safety from an inclusive point of view, we're thinking about what do I need to feel psychologically safe? What do they need? What do we need and how can we do that? And it's a much more collaborative and co-created experience than something that is traditionally spoken about as if it's given or taken. And usually it's spoken about as if the senior person either makes it psychologically, gives you a psychologically safe experience or not, rather than the co-creation of it. So if you're a leader and you don't know what people need, then it's very hard to co-create psychological safety with them, and vice versa. If you want to feel psychologically safe with someone, but you don't know what you need or you haven't communicated that, it's going to be very difficult to have that experience. It can occur because somebody might have an intuitive sense of how to kind of facilitate that with you. But your odds of experiencing psychological safety are a lot lower because you don't know what you need, or you do and you haven't communicated it, or you're hoping that they're going to guess. As the marriage therapist that I go to frequently would say, we're not mind readers. And it's interesting that we keep hoping people will know, but it's our job actually to tell people what we need. And I think that that's really kind of a core principle of inclusion, is this co-creation. I can't just include you in an environment. Like, I don't know if you ever have this, but I've been in groups and people say it's a safe space. And the minute they say that, I know it's not. Because what they're telling me is it's a safe space for me according to what I think is needed. But the fact that they haven't asked, what do we need for this to be a safe space, means that they're assuming we all have the same needs and that we all have the same experience of a barrier to psychological safety. And that's just not true. And so the minute someone says this is a safe space, I don't feel it is. But the minute that they say something like, how can we make this a safe space together? Or, what do you need for this to be a safe space? Then I feel included because they're considering me and what I need and not just telling me that they've met my needs without really knowing them. The other thing is, I think if we want to kind of shift things, we need to really utilize reflective accountability. So, one of the things that can happen frequently is we reflect with our own bias, or we hold ourselves with a level of accountability without maybe having some compassion towards ourselves. And the example that I use for reflective accountability is I go to two clinical supervisors, and a lot of D&I practitioners come to me for supervision because our job is to reflect on the situation and see what we can learn from it. It's not to reflect on the situation and blame and shame. It's not to reflect on the situation and pretend it was somebody else, but to actually reflect on it as part of our responsibility as inclusive leaders or D&I practitioners is to be accountable for actually taking the time to reflect and learn from the experiences that we're having and the impact that we have on others, rather than just always theorizing it or trying to learn it cognitively. Another example is using needs-based decision making. Really great paper by Wilson. There's actually two, 2024 and 2025, the 8 inclusive needs of all people. And Wilson talks about how through doing multiple different pieces of qualitative research, she was able to find a pattern of 8 things that regardless of people's need identities, these 8 things were the pattern of needs that they had. And I push back and I suggest to most organizations now that they use a needs based decision making process rather than identity based, because no identity group is homogenous. And the minute that we think all disabled people this or all people who belong to the LGBTQ plus society, population, sorry, that's not a society that I'm aware of, population have the same requirements, is the minute we homogenize them and again marginalize people further. We don't do that with the dominant norm groups. We don't say this group all has the same needs. So why do we do it with marginalized groups? Well, it's a replication of oppression. And so if we think about a needs-based decision making and we think about what are the needs people have, and some of these needs will be related to their identity, some of these needs will be related to how they can perform, some of these needs will be related to circumstances or this moment in time. But if we use that approach, we can set people up to succeed without lumping people into groups as if those groups all share the same set of needs, which again further marginalizes the group and reduces them to often stereotypes, but also a collection of basic needs rather than individualized or appropriate needs for the setting that they're in. Another one is embodied leadership. So I haven't published this yet, but it is being reviewed at the moment. One of the biggest pieces of feedback that I got from people who are trained to be inclusive leaders and consider themselves to be is how what inclusive leadership is and the practices and the behaviors, and they talked about it. But as they talked about it, it became really clear that they'd conceptualized inclusive leadership but not embodied it. And when we looked at what practices they were talking about in terms of what results in inclusion for people, they weren't talking about it from I statements, they were actually externalizing it. And they were usually externalizing it negatively. So they were saying things like, those people did that wrong because they did X, Y, and Z. But when I would say to them, and tell me how you embodied that or role modeled that or shared that, they'd often struggle with that statement. And it went to show that there's quite a gap because we're doing a lot of cognitive development around D and I work, that there is a gap between cognitively conceptualizing something and actually embodying it. Because when I ask them things like, how do you manage when somebody says to you that you were racist or homophobic? And they were like, oh, it's never happened. And I'm thinking, oh, that's not a sign that we're not being racist or homophobic. That's a sign that people may not be approaching us with that because we might not be demonstrating the openness of inclusive leadership that allows people to approach us and inform us of the gaps in what we know and do, our own blind spots. And so what I really found was that while there was a desire to be effective inclusive leaders, there was often a lack of embodying the very thing they talked about and felt really strongly about. The other thing that I position really strongly is that performance is relational, contextual, and cultural. How we measure performance, how we see performance, how we experience performance is not neutral. It's not generalizable. It's actually quite unique to the relationships at hand, the context that we're working in, and the culture that that's happening within. And the example I give is that in some Asian countries, performance is linked to how late people are in their office. They're considered to be really productive, which translates to performance in the way that they're talking about it. But actually, they don't worry about what time people start in the office. Whereas if we were to take a country like England, if you were starting late in the day, that's often seen as a negative to your performance. You're not taking this job seriously, you come late. And so it's quite interesting how we talk about performances as if it's generalizable, but actually there's a big relational, contextual, and cultural element to it as well. Most metrics that we're using in organizations for diversity and inclusion and performance are weird. So they're Western, they're coming from an educated lens, industrialized, rich democratic settings or cultures. And why this is problematic is the weird lens itself is actually quite centered on individual traits over more environmental influences. So in a weird lens, we'll come back here, it's thinking about the world through a Western viewpoint. It usually is valuing and centering education as being something that gives you privilege and that is valuable. It is often industrialized, so its focus is on industry, whether consciously or unconsciously. Rich being that there's often a high level of privilege in these countries, and democratic is a particular philosophy around governments and governing, right? And so when you take these metrics, it often comes down to a lot of individualism. And that can be quite problematic in a workplace because what we don't always understand is that you might think an individual is a high performer, or you might think an individual is a low performer, but you might not be looking at the environment around them that is impacting their performance levels. The other thing is that we currently measure individual traits and performance through KPIs, key performance indicators. Very rarely do we measure interdependence and collective performance indicators because performance as a group is a different thing to individuals. And a group isn't actually an individual, a collection of individuals performing. It's a step beyond that because they're performing together. So there's interpersonal interactions, they'll have different responsibilities. The interdependence of performance is quite high. If you're waiting for a task to be given to you before you can do your task, for instance, or you need information, or you need meetings, or you need people, well, then measuring your KPIs through an individual lens doesn't really lend to optimal organizational performance, inclusion, or diversity because it's not taking into account these layers. They often overlook culture, power, and the systemic conditions. And that's probably the big pushback on a lot of the weird lenses on performance and inclusion, is that they actually overlook culture, power, and systemic conditions. And an interesting one, when I was looking through the literature, most Western countries, when they were like doing their summary of their research findings, would generalize the results. They would say things like, this could be replicated in other settings. But they made their results generalizable. They didn't state what country they were in. I had to go looking for it. And they often didn't state any kind of cultural nuances of their geography. But countries such as Asian countries, every single time wrote the geographical location and didn't generalize. And that's quite interesting because it shows how even in the research around these topics, how even the researchers writing about it are holding power differently and some are asserting generalizable power, which often happens in cultures that are oppressive in nature because they're dominant, so weird cultures often generalize, assuming that their view is the view, whereas cultures that are often not as privileged or aren't centered in the way that the weird lens is, often don't generalize and make sweeping statements. They appreciate that their view is a view, not the view. And I think that was quite interesting because even within this research, the researchers were replicating something interesting about power. So I kind of like that. The other thing is people often say what gets measured gets valued, and I'd argue and say what gets measured influences what gets valued. What I mean by this is sometimes we don't really value what's being measured. But what we end up doing is valuing the things that will let us get the outcome of what's being measured. So for instance, if I go into a group, and actually this happened with a piece of work I did with an organization last year, I went in and I got the managers to tell me how collaborative their teams are. And then I asked their teams how they would rate their collaboration, and they had a very different score. Now, when we dived into it, they had a different score because the managers, part of the managers' 9 box review was about how well their teams collaborated. And so they overestimated how well their teams collaborated. And they used what I would consider very basic examples of it, like, oh, they speak really well to each other. They talk problems out, to emphasize what was being measured, that this was evidence of what was being measured. But when I talked to the teams, they weren't collaborating very well. And what they were doing is functioning together, but they weren't collaborating. There was a lot of compromise or conflict occurring. And so what was interesting was, because collaboration was one of the measurements managers were being measured by, they were valuing lesser things in order to meet that measurement. And that was a really, I think, a really interesting way of thinking about it. So it's another way that we can think about it. And in inclusion work, if I am valuing something, and this is why we get some pushback sometimes for diversity and inclusion work, if I am valuing something and people are circumventing the problem, so let's say quotas. If I have a quota for a certain identity group in my team, I can, to meet that quota, if I have some kind of gain on it, I can just hire people with that identity, right? Which then leads to people saying things like, that's a diversity hire. It leads to that kind of language. But the real reason for quotas isn't diversity hires. It's two things. It's one, to improve representation and to get the best quality people. But because the quota is being valued and not the purpose of it, it can actually end up being weaponized and, in fact, undermine the very purpose of what's being measured. And so I think that that's an important one for us to keep in mind when we're doing any kind of inclusion work. The other thing is, I use a lot of dialogic OD, and I think it can be really helpful for holding different world views, but also to create space through inclusive conversation. So one of the practices that I recommend and I use is that, rather than always trying to go in and solve the problem, if we can mature the conversation and support the conversation to be inclusive in its practice, and then also add to inclusion. So it uses inclusive practices to actually have the conversation, and we discuss inclusion, we get better results than if I just go in and discuss inclusion in a way, in a practice that is anti-inclusive. I I think that one of our biggest issues is there's a lot of competing, and this is the way it's set up when you get marginalized groups to think that there is a lack of resources and they have to compete with each other. It kind of translates to this idea that inclusion means that we have to lose something, we have to get rid of something, somebody's going to lose. In my opinion, it's actually about bringing more in. It's not about deleting or dominating. It's not the oppression Olympics. It's actually about saying, who are we including? What are we including? Who aren't we including that we need to? What aren't we including that we need to? And by doing this, we can remove some of the less effective behaviors, actions, or assumptions that kind of take up space but don't add value to the outcome that we're trying to create. And that's why I link inclusion and performance, because for me, if I expand the understanding of inclusion and it expands the frame, then I'm able to actually get better outcomes and results. And that's really hard to argue with. It's much easier to argue with this idea that I just want to include some people or some things, and that means that we don't have resources for others. That's an easier position to manage than if expanding is actually improving things. If inclusion is improving not just the experience individuals are having, but also the impact that those individuals can have in the workplace. And so for me, I talk about it as expanding the frame, not deleting it. If we were talking about society, I might have a different position, but within an organizational context specifically, I'm talking about expanding it, because if you attempt to delete it without a high level of support and change skills and processes and people with those capabilities, it can actually cause an awful lot of disruptions, and then people will default. So for me, expanding is nearly a more effective way to do it in an organizational setting. I'm not saying that's the same in society. So what I'd really like to know is, and I know I've just kind of gone boom, 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 but before I kind of share one or two pieces and hopefully answer some questions or have a conversation, is I'd really like to get a sense of what kind of small shift could you make in your life and work that might be helpful. And it doesn't have to be something I've said. It could just be something that came to you from being here today yourself. It might have been something that happened 10 weeks ago and that you've been chewing over. But I'd like a sense of what kind of small shift you might be able to make in your life so that you could embody inclusive leadership more, so that you can create more ease for yourself and also be more effective in all that you do. So it'd be really nice if you could in the chat give me some ideas about shifts you could make, because it will help me also understand how this is landing for you. And also you can use the Q&A because I'd rather not be talking at you. So I'm going to give you a chance to write it in the chat so that I'm not here talking about inclusion without having some input from others. But I will go to two other points as well, but I would really love you to share your ideas in the chat. I believe that inclusion starts with a conversation, so a connection and a conversation, but it continues with actions. And I think sometimes we skip the conversation and go straight to actions, or vice versa. We have the conversation all day long and we don't take the actions. I believe that both of those things are required in order for inclusion to be something that we can all experience. And in order to be an inclusive leader, and you could be a social leader, a thought leader, or a positional leader, in order to be an inclusive leader, you need to be having conversations and you need to take the appropriate actions. Otherwise, you'll build up people's hope that you're understanding them, but then you'll let them down by not actually following through or moving forward in some way. And the one other piece is that sustainable change, there's lots of different research on this from lots of different kind of models, but the change that I've witnessed through my own work that is sustainable in this area, it is relational, it is reflective, and it's responsive. And what I mean by this is it understands that the quality of the relationship we have with ourselves and others, and that others have with the organization and each other, has an impact on whether the change we're trying to create will be sustainable. Reflective meaning that we don't just charge ahead with what we think is right, but we notice the emerging data. Some of it will be quantitative, some will be qualitative. What kind of information are we getting? What are we learning about ourselves and others in this process? And how can that current information help me be more effective? So that reflective piece so that you can adapt live. And the responsive is really, really important, because sometimes we make decisions because we think they're good decisions, but they're not responsive to needs. They might be our preference. We might like how it feels to have cupcakes and parties and, celebrations and keynote speakers. And we might feel good about those things. But the question is, does it respond? Is it responsive to the unmet needs of people in the organization? Because if it isn't responsive to the unmet needs of people in the organization, we are not going to be able to create the experience of inclusion with them. They're not going to feel like they belong if we're not thinking about their needs and responding to them. And they're not going to feel valued for their uniqueness if we're not responding to their uniqueness and the potential needs and value that that brings. And so sustainable change around inclusion needs those three R's: relational, reflective, and responsive. And if you want to know more about these things, I'm going to stop sharing in a second. So hopefully you'll have some questions or comments, or we can have a chat. But if you want to know more about the kind of concepts and read a bit more about the research, because I didn't want to put all the references up, they are in the book, and you can get that book. The other thing is this will bring you to the .co.uk Amazon. You can just delete that and put .com and it'll bring you straight to the .com example. And to finish off, just before I leave you, two statements. Inclusive leadership is a practice, not a fixed identity. Because inclusion means facilitating an experience with people, it's not something I am or I'm not. It's something I am either doing on a continuous basis or not attempting to do. And for anybody who is fearful about getting it wrong and thinks, oh, there's so much to do, and there will always be so much to do, we don't really have time to wait for the perfect solution. And so I always lean on take the next best step, not the perfect one. Progress over perfection. That isn't my statement. That comes from lots of different groups. But I try to lean on the taking the next best step. Sometimes that will be stepping back and being strategic, taking a systemic view. Sometimes it's about improving this moment in this way and normalizing that so that people can realize that these standards are appropriate to expect and to offer to others. And so that would be my final closing statement. I'm going to stop sharing and check if there's any Q&As or if anybody else would like to speak or add anything or clarify anything. There we go. Oh, some great examples. I didn't see them. I'm so glad I've seen them now. Some great examples. Be curious to learn more. Do you know, it's easy to be curious when we like people. The thing I've learned is I have to learn to be really curious when I don't like people. Like maybe I disagree with them, maybe they're homophobic, maybe they're misogynistic. But actually, I found that the people I disagree with the most, if I bring curiosity to it, I can usually find a way forward. Um, in organizations, in workplaces, politically and in society is a different story. But in the workplace, our job is to find a way to work together. And so when I agree with everyone, they're easier to be curious about. But when I don't agree with somebody, that's where actually curiosity can be really valuable, but is much, much harder. Um, the suggestion box, actually, that's a really good idea. Problem. I'm just having a look. A review for myself. Really brilliant. I have a Friday review that I do. First of all, where I list wins, and wins are any effort. It's not just about like what went well, because we'll do a lot and it won't always go well. But the wins are the things I showed up for and tried. And then also I have a review that I do every 2 weeks around my practice. So when I'm coaching or when I'm doing development work or when I'm consulting, I review that with two different supervisors to think about what I could do better and maybe where I'm replicating white supremacy, oppression, exclusion, marginalization, um, so that I can weave that into doing better next time. Sorry, I think I've missed some comments. Lots of good comments. Okay. Okay. Does anyone have any questions and I know we're just 4 minutes to the hour, or anything that maybe they want to add? We can all read each other's comments, so that's great. But I think you can also come off mute or use the Q&A if you do. Otherwise, I'm really grateful that you joined me. And now I can look at these chat. I didn't see them coming up, so my apologies. But it's really helpful to see how other people are seeing it and experiencing it as well. It's interesting. So Dr. Leah said, I see it as the systems and structures required to create the opportunity for belonging. I think that that's really interesting because I think that that's very important. We've had some interesting things legally in the UK. I'm not based in the UK, but I work in the UK often. And what's happened is they've altered legislation to almost say that the system isn't what's accountable. And it's the first time that I've seen anything kind of across Ireland, the UK, or Europe do that. And also, actually, their definition of racism isn't the systemic oppression of people or marginalization. In law, their definition is being treated less than based on race, and so they're very strongly rejecting a kind of systemic lens in some of the legislation. Oh, so you can connect with me by my name, Sheila Walsh 1. You can go to sheilawalsh.com. But if you go to Sheila Walsh 1 on LinkedIn or Instagram, you'll meet me. LinkedIn has more professional stuff. Instagram is more me panicking about my research and taking pictures of weekend trips. But I do talk about inclusion there as well. Excellent. The recording will be shared, and so will the slides. Great, Elia. It's great to hear that you have something to reflect on. And again, it's not the answer, it's a point of view, and you might be able to expand it to alter it to something that you think, actually, from my worldview and my experience, I would take that and expand it to this perspective. And that's really good. Like that's what we should be doing with inclusion work, is building that diverse perspective and experience. So if anybody does expand on anything that I said or is triggered anything, do get in contact and let me know, because that is actually my favorite part of this work, is learning from others. And especially around these things when they're feeding back and saying, I thought about it this way or with this perspective. Because otherwise we all get stuck in our own worldview all too easily and our own points of view. Okay. Yeah, so the deck will be shared, and so will the presentation. And please do follow up with me if anybody has brought it to life or has a challenge on something or a different point of view. That's all from me. I don't know, Amber or... Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
I'm here.
I can see that. I'm not sure, does anyone want to say goodbye to the participants, or is it okay for me to close that?
You can close it.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. Go and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and thanks for joining us.
And I will send you that information now.
Perfect.
And then let me know what I need to do. as far
Just
as
once I have an address for you both, that's no problem.
as far as cost and everything, because
No, 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 that's no problem. We won't be. I think it's still recording though. I don't have control over that. I don't
oh,
think.
I can stop the recording.